Welcome back to Tuesday Night Legacy, where we showcase Magic's most powerful formats. I'm AJ here with Ben to talk about
Maverick. Naya Maverick.
So why Maverick?
So I like playing the creature toolbox aspect of it because it's kind of a solution for every problem. It's a deck that doesn't do anything the best, but it does almost everything really well. So it plays an entire toolbox of creatures based around the technology of Green Sun Zenith, and it plays a lot of different utility lands through the use of Knight of the Reliquary.
Gotcha, makes sense. So what are the win cons for this deck? It seems here we've got a bunch of, like, couple of these, couple of those, and then a bunch of one-ups. What are the win cons, though?
The strongest creatures in the deck are obviously the Knight and Questing Beast. But any one of these creatures can become a potent threat. Hex Drinker later on in the game and Scavenging Ooze can both get quite large quite quickly later on.
There you go. Gotcha. And then I notice here in the pile of one-ups we have a Clothis. Is that a win con too, or is that just there for the value?
It's a little bit of both. It's the first time I'm playing it. It's great against the decks that are relying on the graveyard without just comboing off straight from the graveyard. So anything that's looking for either Delirium or just value out of the graveyard, it's great at removing those. It can also keep my life up a little bit while siphoning every turn, or just provide a small boost to mana.
Makes sense. Alright, and then how does it play? Like, what is a typical, like, play line, play patterns that you try to go for?
The goal against a blind opponent would be a Mana Dork, either a Noble Hierarch or the one of Birds of Paradise on turn 1, or Green Sunning for the Dryad Arbor, which you can do on turn 1, Green Sunning for 0. So you want ideally 3 mana on turn 2. What you do with that 3 mana kind of depends.
Makes sense.
A Knight is a great play. Another option is Thalia into Wasteland to keep everybody playing as slow as possible. Because one of the big goals of this deck is to just make everybody play fair Magic, which in Legacy is not what everybody wants to do. So if I can make everybody play as slowly as I do, it's a great scenario. Makes
sense. All right. And then we've seen you on different Maverick piles. How long have you been on specifically this list, and how have you liked it so far?
This is my second tournament on this list. It's felt very good. A lot of times I'm tuning more towards what I expect the meta to be on the whole, not necessarily for the store. And this is more tuned towards the store finally, after some time. I was playing Punishing Fire for a while, which is great in the Delver matchup, but unfortunately, compared to everything else, we don't have the largest Delver pool of players here. So,
yeah, that's true. All right, and then let's talk about these one-ofs. So we'll start on the right here, far right, with the Hex Drinker. What's it for? What matchups is it good in? Is it just like a win con, or is there other aspects to it?
So Hex Drinker is mostly just a win con and a creature of opportunity. It's great later on in the game when I've got a few creatures in the battlefield. I can Green Sun for it for 2 mana, and then if I have either a few Mana Dorks or a Knight in play, I can also grab the Gaia's Cradle off of Knight, and I can put it up to 4 or 8 counters usually within the turn or the next turn.
That's pretty good, getting it into Mini Progenitus pretty quickly. The one of Birds of Paradise, just for fixing purposes?
Yeah, that's just for fixing, and it's also good against, it's a safety use against Plague Engineer, so not all of my Mana Dorks are killed the turn they come into play.
Makes sense. And then we'll move on to the probably weirdest one of Scrib Ranger.
Scrib Ranger is a quiet house.
How? Why?
So it's surprise in a lot of situations where, because it has flash and pro blue, it can come down, it can block a Murktide for days. It can come into play and untap a creature as a blocker. It can also untap a Knight so that I can both tutor for a land and attack with the Knight in the same turn. Things like that. It can also it's a surprising amount of mana early on in the game. There have been times where I've been stuck on 1 or 2 lands, and I've still been able to play like Questing Beast just because I'm tapping a mana dork and then a land, returning the land
Playing
to
the
untap
land.
the mana dork, play the land, and now all of a sudden I have 1 land and 1 mana dork, and I've got 4 mana in play.
Makes sense. So Outland Liberators, another one of in the main deck. Why is that here? What is it for? What matchups is it good against?
So it's, in a lot of cases, very similar to just Kazali Pride Mage.
Okay.
Comes in, I have the opportunity to blow up an artifact if I need to. However, there are times where against slower decks or against decks that don't have a lot going on every single turn, such as like 8 cast or something, where if they hit a slow point, then it flips, and on the other side, it destroys an artifact every single time it attacks, and it becomes a 3/3. So the Knight version is very much a boon to the slower matchups, or I can pass turn without doing anything if I've got some kind of instance I can play. Or part of the reason I'm running 4 Endurances is that I have interaction that I can use on their turn,
Makes
so
sense.
that I can allow it to flip.
There we go. And then we'll move on to the one of Collector Oof. Is that specifically just for artifact-based matchups, or is that good in other matchups too?
So that hits just about every deck. There's very few decks that don't run artifacts. In lands decks, it hits the Mox Diamonds. In the 8 casts, things like that, it's still useful, or it's very useful.
Vile too.
Yeah, Vile against Death and Taxes type decks. So there's very few times it's just a 2/2 bear. And even when it is, it's still a bear. It's not the worst creature I can play. But most of those times, such as like Delver, that's one of the cards that's fastest to come out.
Fair enough. And then we'll move on to the Scavenging Ooze. Just Graveyard Hate in the main deck, essentially.
Yep, Graveyard Hate in the main deck. Also a great use to dump Guy's Cradle mana into.
Makes sense.
It gets huge later on. And then I play a lot of creatures, so I can grow it because I don't anticipate all of my creatures sticking around all the time. But a lot of other decks also will have to chump block into either a Knight or something else. So it's big there.
Gotcha. The one of Ramanap Excavator.
Recursion of Wasteland is just gross sometimes.
Can confirm. Pretty gross thing to do regularly. Also good with like the one of Horizon Canopy, or if you need to get back lands and keep ramping.
You can also keep replaying Dryad Arbor with it as just
Ooh,
a blocker every single turn.
I like that. And then the card with the most text in the game, it seems like. Why are we playing Questing Beast?
Questing Beast just does everything. It's a wall of text. It's pretty gross. It's a legendary creature, so I can save it with Karakas. It has
Very relevant.
Vigilance, Death Touch, and Haste, so it's a threat the turn it comes down.
Can't be blocked by 2 or less.
It can be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less. All damage dealt by it all combat damage dealt by its controller. So any of my creatures dealing combat damage, that damage can't be prevented. So cards like Glacial Chasm, that sometimes lands rely on to stabilize are just completely blanked.
And then the last part, when it connects to your opponent.
The last part, if it deals damage to an opponent, it deals that much damage to a planeswalker that player controls. So
Found that out the hard way today.
Yeah, so occasionally it just comes down, deals 4, and also kills off either a Teferi or a Wandering Emperor or a Chase, just as a 4-drop or 5-drop through Green Sub-Zenith.
Gotcha. We'll move on to the sideboard now. So we'll start on the right side here with Choke.
Just blue-based control is sometimes the roughest matchups, just because they can do a lot. So anything we can do to hamper them.
Makes sense. Force of Vigors, only 2, but I do see next to it we have a Knight of Autumn.
Yeah, so I've got a surprising amount of artifact hate, but it's kind of dispersed through a few different cards.
Couple elements.
Yeah, Force of Vigors are there because it also deals with enchantments.
Urza
Sagas, things like that. And then the Knight, same deal. It's a tutorable Green Sun Zenith target that can take out any artifact or enchantment. I very rarely use the Gain 4 life, and I think I've only once used the comes into play as a 4/3. So
very rarely. It doesn't need to be a big body. It has an ETB effect.
Yep.
All right, the one of Umizawa's Jite.
So it's going to be 2 of, but right now I've only got the 1. It's good against the smaller creatures that can kind of blank a lot of mine. So Knight can get blocked by any 1/1, things like that. So realistically, I want something that can deal with 1/1s, 2/2s, things like that out of the sideboard. Things like death and taxes that start going wider can be answered by a GT or elves, stuff like that. Just and in a lot of cases, they just happen to be better than some of the other spells on it.
Fair enough. That card next to it.
Seeds of Innocence.
Yeah.
So Seeds of Innocence is great against the everything is an artifact deck.
Fair.
Like 8-cast Kappa style decks where it just blows up everything they've got. Sure, they gain some life, but realistically, if I'm swinging with Knight, it's usually an 8/8 or larger. So
Makes sense. Then the 3 of Deafening Silence. Just combo hate?
Yep, just combo hate.
Simple enough.
Also pretty good against the E-cast, surprisingly. On the play, I wouldn't necessarily do it, but if it's something that you're worried about and you have other cards that you're not considering or don't think it's that great, you can definitely run those 2.
Makes sense. And then we have a split between Pyroblast and Red Blast. It's 3 blasts and 1 pyro.
Yep. No real reason for the split. If you are in a meta where
Meddling Mage.
Spellskite?
Spellskite, yeah.
Spellskite cannot be targeted by the Red Elemental Blast, so it can't be redirected, whereas Pyroblast can. Pyroblast can deal with things like phantasmal images, copying non-red spells. That's really neither one prominent here, but
Something you can do.
Just in the instance where if that is something that you're worried about in your meta, something that you should consider.
All right, well, we'll hop back to the main deck to look a little bit real quick at a few last things. We'll start with the removal package that you have with 2 Prismatic and 4 Swords. Is there just not a need for more?
For the most part, no. In a lot of cases, my creatures are either avoiding them, or my creatures are dealing with them, or I don't care about them. So there's not that many creatures that these 6 spells can't remove that I'm worried about in a timely fashion.
Fair enough. And then we'll do the one-ofs lands right here. The Dryad Arbor.
Dryad Arbor is just another turn 1 accelerant off of Green Sun Zenith. It's also tutorable.
Blocker.
It's a blocker that can be recurred by the Excavator. You can also tutor it up on the turn that Jace is played, or Teferi's played, and clear the Teferi out, which is surprisingly come up quite a few times. Next up, we have Horizon Canopy. It's just the original, sack it, draw card.
It's in the colors, you might as well.
Yep, and it's also recurable with the Excavator.
And then the Caracas.
Caracas is an answer to a lot of creatures, and I play a few legendaries myself, so it also bounces my creatures back to my hand.
There you go. Lets you save your creatures while also dealing with theirs. Not always the worst thing to be doing.
Yeah.
And then finally, last card we'll talk about is the one of Gaia's Cradle.
So sometimes you have a bunch of creatures on board, and it does a few things. First, it lets you go very large on a Green Sun Zenith with very few lands in play. So
helpful.
It can also just level up a Hex Drinker all in one turn to Progenitus.
Mana sinks and
Yeah,
stuff.
you can use it for the Scavenging Ooze to do a ton there. And then one of the things that it actually does is it just counters a Tabernacle.
It does counter a Tabernacle. Well, this has been Ben on his Maverick list from Tuesday Night Legacy. I'm AJ. This has been Ben. And we'll see you in the next one.